Well, hi everyone. So, I'm going to take down the smooth jazz. I thought if that was an abrupt change of music. I'm sorry. Hello everyone. It is Kristi. It is Sunday. It is time for Social Science Sunday. I hope you are all doing well, and hopefully my volume is okay. I'll keep a little eye on the chat, make sure that that is all working out all right. But yes, welcome everyone. You're going to be joining me now for this really exciting trip into social science research methods, which, doesn't necessarily sound as exciting and as interesting as it really is. But I'm hoping I'm going to change your mind and make you realize that actually social science is like really super cool and complex, and there's some really interesting ideas in it, and get really excited about it. So yeah, we're going to get going. To be fair, this lecture that I'm going to give, I gave for both my quants and my qual class. At the end of the day, social research has the same philosophical groundings, mostly in terms of like looking at the world for information. It's just kind of like how the data are interpreted that are that are done a little bit differently. And so this is going to kind of quote, because also the reason why in my courses I didn't want to only give the quants philosophy to the quant students and the qual philosophy to the qual students is because it's a mixed modes approach. I take a very mixed modes approach. I think if you can triangulate experimental research with survey research with qualitative research, then and you're finding similar patterns independently with all these different ways of looking at the world and investigating it, then you're really onto something, is the way that I take it. What was this? I don't know, you guys are talking about stuff. So anyway, all right, so what we're going to do is look at the start of the lecture. We're going to deal with what exists, why we think what exists, and how can we know about it. When I did these lectures in the classroom, I had 50 minutes to basically go over all of the history of philosophy. It was too much. And what I want to do here is really take some time and get some interaction, because the aim here isn't for you to just sit and absorb like a history class or a documentary where you're like, oh, these are facts I can absorb. I would really like it if what the content encourages is for you to like rethink or remind yourself, how complicated reality is. I think I'm a little blown out light-wise, but that's all right. We'll sort that out another time. All right, we all ready to head off and take our trip to the wild and exciting world of social research methods? Okay, let's go. All right, that means I have to change screens. And there we are. Okay, so let's go ahead with the slide from the beginning. Come on, from the beginning. Come on. Come on, Word. There we go. Just takes a couple times for PowerPoint to get the hint. By the way, I want to just quickly say hi to Easy7 for stopping by, Dean Fan in the chat. I think I saw Faye Queen Corey, Lindsay Rogers in the chat, and I thought I saw Ahana too, but maybe not yet. All right. As I said, it says qualitative, but it works for both. And these are the lecture notes I used when I did my graduate courses, and very similar. We did more advanced statistics in the graduate courses, but the same basic grounding for my undergrad course as well. So you don't have to do the homework. You won't be writing any essays, and you won't be learning a statistical software package. But you're getting content here that people paid, tuition to sit in on. So enjoy. All right. Oh, come on. There we go. Come on. There we go. Forward. If you are interested in reading more on the topics that I cover in the course of this PowerPoint presentation over the next week or two, a lot of the information, and again, this, they're all kind of dated now because I was teaching in sort of 2020, 2009 at the time. But you can always, like Bryman, I don't know if there's a fourth edition by now. I'm sure there is a fourth edition of Social Research Methods by Bryman. It's a very widely used book on the social sciences in the UK. I don't really know. I think he's Australian, and I think he's quite well known around the world in terms of like having this textbook out. But you can always go and look for a used copy, for instance, of this textbook and read up more or look further into these topics. Another person that we are going to be covering is Burr. I think I might have shown you before the book on social constructionism, and that is one that looks more at like a qualitative perspective. And then a really good but quite high level and complicated book near the end, Moses and Torbjorn, Ways of Knowing, Competing Methodologies in Social and Political Research. Those are the primary publications that I read through and organized some of the, well, to be honest, I was handed down lectures that the previous course instructor had created, who had received them from the previous course instructor they created, and so on down the line. And you inherit these and you update them for yourself, and make sure that you like know all the topics and have good sources. These were the ones that I found and updated my own lecture notes with, but they're quite standard in terms of the things that they draw on. Oh, I'm gonna hold on. Keep up with your chat. You're ready to attempt to learn? No attempt. You just have to sit back and absorb. All right. Now, when it comes to doing social research, see if you agree with this. All right. See if you think that this is a comprehensive list of what you can do in social research. When people go out into the world to investigate what is and, understand things better, they're essentially engaging in one of three types of analyses. The first one is what is happening when you have a phenomenon that has been under-researched or unresearched. Then your first job as a social researcher is to describe what you see. And this isn't unique to social research. This is what Darwin did. This is what all, researchers do. If you notice a phenomenon that hasn't really been described before, or the causal mechanisms that you think are at work haven't been articulated clearly, then that descriptive analysis in itself is a massive contribution. Think about the contribution of Darwin putting a bunch of different pieces together in order to generate the theory of evolution, or Marx stepping back and looking at the structures and processes of capitalism and how they function routinely, right? People saw that before, but they didn't have a language for it. Olson's logic of collective action, or the median voter theory, right? There are a lot of things that once it is explained to us, you're like, oh yeah, of course that's going on. But until someone explains that to us, those categories don't exist. Sort of related, but not really, is so like I said, I'm going to kind of indulge myself in these lecture notes. And if we don't get through where I want to in a week, I don't care, because I feel like these topics really need to breathe. And we get so focused on teaching methods that we don't really think about what it means to know things or how we can reliably know things. So I'm glad for this opportunity to do it. But when we talk about like what is happening and this descriptive analysis, it might seem very banal or mundane or not that important. But if you think about the way that people interact with the world, if there isn't a word for something, it's either kind of invisible or it doesn't really exist. Like the people exist, the situation exists, but the phenomenon as something people can talk about doesn't exist. And let me give an example. I'm often quite critical of the Bible and its writings. And one of the critiques that I have that I think really reflects its patriarchal violence and very toxic norms is the fact that there's no even approaching the idea that a man could be assaulted by another man. There is no category of abuse that exists. There is only a sin, which condemns in this case, the abuser and the abused in equal fashion. So what happens when there's no name for the kind of victim experience a person has? Like, they can't even be acknowledged as a victim. They have no sense of their identity as a victim. The community doesn't see them as that because they have literally no way of talking about that phenomenon. And as a consequence, you end up getting this really gendered notion of crimes in this area. I'm trying to avoid demonetization, but I think you know what I'm going for here. And it's a way, so descriptive analysis, is a big part of liberation and emancipation work, because there are things that are accepted and unspoken about, or things that are not discussed because it's inconvenient. And being able to give a name to something and a label and a relationship between phenomenon, cause and effect, or looking at the way things interact with each other in a more systematic way, in a routine way, or how certain attitudes lead to certain behaviors, all of that is necessary in order to have the tools to do the next part, which is causal analysis. You can't measure what you can't see, and you can't measure what you can't define. Another part of descriptive analysis is coming up with definitions, outlining the borders of concepts. And because unlike the natural sciences, social sciences, we don't have like ways of measuring water or ways of measuring heat that are consistent and will also be found to be consistent across the world, or across the universe even. How then do we measure things? Well, in order to measure things, you need some sort of standard of measurement. And in our case, in the social sciences, that means using words. We're linguistically defining concepts. We're putting linguistic boundaries around certain ideas in order to be able to separate them out and look at how they connect with other phenomena more clearly. Descriptive analysis it is incredibly important for laying the foundations for the rest of the research you do. And the other thing too, I think it's worthy of mentioning, is that in the natural sciences, I think they would have much more difficulty having multiple definitions for the same phenomenon. For instance, salt, chemically, is salt, is salt, is salt. Oxygen is oxygen, is oxygen. But democracy in Greece and democracy, let's say, in the Viking tribes where they would elect their kings, and democracy in the United States are not the same things. We use the same words, but they're not the same things. And that means that in the social sciences, unlike in the natural sciences, you can have 15 different definitions for something. If you've got, well-sourced, sensical, empirically grounded in reality and, history and experience definitions, then you can have 15 different definitions of feminism. But you just have to specify which one you're working with so that everyone is working with the same conceptual toolkit or framework that's going on. All right, so I'm going to kind of dip into what people are saying. Taking sociology was most useful for learning language that can be used for explaining stuff, at least for me, said Faye Queen Corey. Yes, and that is because social reality isn't as obvious as, I agree with that completely. And I think it's because social reality isn't as doesn't present itself as self-evidently as the natural world does. And as a consequence, when you can learn a term that describes something, like I remember when I learned the term incel, right? And now I've got a whole category of individuals with a certain set of attitudes and certain types of behavior whom we can observe operating in a certain kind of social media space. Without that term incel, you'd have to sort of reinvent the wheel to describe what the phenomenon is. And giving language to things is very powerful and very useful. All right, once we have so that's descriptive analysis. And it gets a short shrift because so much emphasis is put on inferential statistics and being able to control for things, or doing panel studies and doing change over time or whatever. But at the end of the day, the core work that first has to be done is descriptive analysis. It's very important. The second thing that social researchers deal with is, why does this happen? Or in what way is this phenomenon produced? So it's a causal kind of what are the series of relationships that when they come together produce this sort of outcome? And causal analysis, my apologies, causal analysis is, if you wanted to just to link qualitative work with descriptive analysis. Hold on, I'm getting froggy. Let me warm have a think about the relationship between qualitative analysis and descriptive analysis, and I will be right back. All right, now I think I'm still froggy. Nothing I can do, just gonna go with it. All right, so qualitative research is generally grounded in language, sometimes in symbols, sometimes in facial gestures, sometimes in other observable human behaviors or expressions. But generally, the purpose of qualitative research is to provide thick, rich description of a particular phenomenon in a particular context. So the role of descriptive analysis and qualitative research are very, very important. And then when we get to the causal analysis, this is more of a, I would say, a scientific approach in that causality you demonstrate most reliably if you adhere to correspondence theory and other elements of being accurate about the world you're speaking of. But if you can do the falsification where you make a prediction about what the world would look like if your theory was in effect and operating, and a prediction as to what the world would look like if your theory didn't work at all. And that kind of risky prediction of articulating a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis to really lock you into what you think these causal mechanisms are and how they operate. That is a causal analysis. So you can't do causal analysis with qualitative research because it's not designed for that. But with quantitative research, because it is deductive and we're using the scientific method, we're testing things, we don't always get good ground up results. We're looking at how our theories perform. That's why you need both qualitative and quantitative working together to continue to generate feedback loop, as it were. Causal analysis is incredibly important and powerful because it allows us a very special type of knowledge, I would argue. It allows us a knowledge that has withstood falsification, which I think is really the most rigorous way we can investigate the world. And therefore, when we find something that has been obtained, the data has been obtained from a good sample, and there are sufficient enough observations for us to conduct our analyses, and we have a very good idea of what we think our theory should do, and how the world would look if we did our analysis, as well as how we would know if we were wrong, how it would look if the theory wasn't in effect. Then by applying quantitative methods, we can have a level of certainty about our causal relationships that is quite unique. Experimental work too does, like effects, but experimental work often works with very smaller sample sizes. Whereas survey research, you're really trying to generalize out to an entire population. And when you can look at a whole collection of behaviors or demographics or things that might cause a person to take a position on X or Y or a Z, then to be able to run numbers and say with statistical margins of error, these are the top 3 things that explain the phenomenon in question. That allows us an understanding of human behavior and processes, social processes, that is unobtainable in any other way. Qualitative work has its own great advantages, understanding people's understanding of themselves and the world. But if we really want to talk about how people as a group function, how the world works, then you need quants. And so they make a contribution as well to allow us a level of certainty in our conclusions that we can't get any other way. We can only get it through quantitative analysis and rejecting the null hypothesis and having a statistical significance of at least p equals 0.5, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. All right. Now, building on that is the last category of analysis, which is normative. And normative analysis, and I'm quoting my own PhD supervisor's notes here on this, so thank you, Professor Sanders. It asks one of 2 questions. How can we make better things happen? Or how can we make the things that are happening now better? It's what we'd call a normative analysis. It doesn't go in without values. it doesn't go in saying, I have an objective scientific perspective where, I'm going to treat fascism as being an equally valid system of government as democracy and just let the numbers run and speak for themselves. Normative analysis is located in some sort of framework of better and worse. Whether that better is more efficient or more compassionate or more cost effective or, whatever it happens to be, that we know we're not judging a process simply on its functions alone. We're evaluating the effect of that process on the quality of people's lives. And of course, you could have, in theory, normative analysis that comes from a capitalist, pro-capitalist perspective. You can have normative analysis that comes at it from a Marxist critique perspective. And at the end of the day, my view on this is, as long as you're transparent about where you sit in these debates so that I know, like, the framing that you're giving me, and I can use that to contextualize your interpretations, right? Then, I think you just need to be transparent with that so that people can understand and critique and engage with your normative analysis, not only your maybe causal analysis. So as I said, the kinds of phenomenon that we are, like, as social researchers, want to investigate ultimately kind of comes down into these three categories, and we use qualitative and quantitative approaches in order to answer these questions. Now, the main difference between qualitative and quantitative research is the way that we would think about the questions to be asked. We would have different approaches in terms of how we think the relationships should be extracted from the data, text or numbers. And we have different ways of systematizing our analysis in order to generate, or in order to identify the relevant data from irrelevant data, or not relevant in this context data, and present it in an open and transparent way that allows others to peer review and see how we came to our conclusions. You're not late at all. Easy 7, it's fine. We're still on explaining social phenomenon. If you read this slide, you're all caught up. And my approach, my answer would be, when it comes to, if you are interested in a particular social phenomenon, then what you need to do is use the method that best answers that question. What we don't want in social research is the whole thing, when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you're really good at time series analysis, bunny for you, that's great, but not every question is going to be suitable to a time series analysis structure. And so you can't try to make the data into something that you know how to do. In order to analyze it, you need to adapt your understanding of the phenomenon, the methods you use, and your methods of interpretation based on that question. And that's why understanding ontology and epistemology is so fundamental. And again, I don't think it gets enough time and attention, but it really, there are in some ways like two different existences when you use a qual versus a quants framework. And they're not incompatible, but they are completely different. And so we're going to get to those. All right, we're going to talk about ontology. What does it mean to say something exists? What exists, and how can things exist? This will be like I think the core contention. And this is the core contention when we look at people who offer things like gender essentialism, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Once you have an idea of how things can exist and what can exist in your ontological framework, then, hello, a moped. Then the next step is to ask, well, based on how I think things exist, how can we know accurately what exists? And what kind of follows is this history of philosophy of social science and social science after we get through ontology and epistemology. But So this is from Grix. If this is the when King Crocoduck like mocked this guy for writing a book called The Foundations of Research because he's in sports science, this was what he was mocking. Despite the fact that you saw the second slide was like, here are the 4 core books, and I just like from Grix I only got this little chart, which I thought was really helpful. So yeah, hating on sports medicine people who do medical science. So anyway, I always feel bad for Grix, that King Crocoduck, like, just put him in the firing line so ignorantly. I always feel like I should defend him. But so the building blocks of research, and I think you can really look at this from either a natural sciences or a social science. It's still going to be the same thing. But before you can go out into the world and investigate things, you have to know what's out there to know. And if something does exist, how does it exist? So I know where to look for it and how to look for it. And that leads on to epistemology. What and how can we know about that thing or things that we think exist? Once you're like, okay, I think that there is a sociological effect of aging, and it's in like a physical, natural process on par with, like other things in the natural sciences, and I can know about it because I can find out when someone was born, and then I can estimate their age, and I'll be able to track this effect of age on them over their lifetimes, because it should operate in the same way on everybody, or pretty much. So how would I go about doing that? Well, in this case, my methods for acquiring valid knowledge would be quantitative. And so methodology is more like the school of methods. So here you're looking at quantitative methods, survey methods, experimental methods. You might be looking at secondary data analysis, official statistics, using that. You might be doing some multi-level modeling, looking at aggregate level factors as well as individual level factors. But whatever it is, it's going to be using a series of quantitative, deductive, survey or experimental-based data, and then you're going to run some kind of statistical analysis. And that's the umbrella of tools that you have in the approaches you have in your methodology. On the qual side, for instance, it would be different. It would be looking at how people understand themselves or how people talk about things. And so from a methodological perspective on qualitative, it would be not numbers-based, but text-based or symbol, images, based. If you're looking at, let's say, political campaign material, and you want to understand what colors are used and what pictures are used and what words are used and where they're put in there to understand how the people are supposed to be reading them. All of that is more based on using language and text and concepts. And then underneath methodology, so you got your quants methodology, you got your qual methodology, and under that you have your methods. Your methods are your specific modes of analysis. So on the quant side, you'd have descriptive statistics, you might have correlation analysis, just like running some basic correlations to see if some of these independent variables actually go up or down, or they mirror each other with an inverse relationship. You can look at principal components analysis or factor analysis. You can look at basic bivariate regression, and then you get into the more complicated forms of regression, ordinary least squares, weighted least squares, logistic regression, time series analysis, panel data analysis, multi-level modeling, and you have all different types of tools to carry out investigations using statistical methods and statistical theories and very well established practices in mathematics that we know and we've tested, and we know it allows us to generalize to a wider population. Once you know what your question is, what exists, how you can know about it, which field you're going to go into, and what methods you're going to use, then you can look for appropriate data. Either you can find data and download it and do the analysis, or you might have to collect it yourselves. And that's the step, like how you get from a big idea down to a practical, asking a person a question on a survey that you can use to, their answers in a pool amongst another 250 or maybe even 5,000 respondents in order to answer your question. And those are the foundation, those are the building blocks of research. And the ones that we're going to really focus on this time, as I've said, is ontology and epistemology. The first bullet point, ontology, is a question of like what exists, and the second one is epistemology, and the third is methodology. I think I'm repeating myself, so all right. Let's start with ontology, and we're going to think about it first from the physical world perspective. Okay, let's just think about in terms of things around you, right? Chair, hair, curtains, walls, right? Because the self-evident manifestations of physical properties are the easiest ones for us to understand. There are sensory impressions, right? This is what the Enlightenment thinkers talked about when they talked about, the tabula rasa. Ontology, so we're going to say, what exists? What exists? And from philosophy, ontology is an explicit formal specification of how to represent the objects, concepts, and other entities that are assumed to exist in some area of interest and the relationships that hold among them. So bare bones ontology is our attempt to answer the question, what exists? And as an extension of this question, we can go on to ask, what does it mean to exist? What does it mean to say something does not exist? What is an object? Can one give an account of what it means to say that an object exists? From a natural science point of view, I think most people would probably fall into the camp of materialism. That basically, like, there's stuff in the world. There's physical, there's stuff, right? And here's like my little plastic lemon that I use to throw into water to give it a little fresh thing, right? And it has a material existence. It's pretty easy. Now, some things that have material existence are not easy to observe. Gases, electricity, obviously certain types of wavelengths that our eyes can't pick up without special technology. But from a natural science point of view, things that exist can be picked up on through observation, some kind of form of observation using our sensory powers. Sight, smell, hear, whatever, it has a physical manifestation. And we're just talking about the physical sciences now. And when you do that, you can start asking some really interesting questions too, like what does it mean to constitute, water, to say water exists, or like, is it steam? Because it exists as steam, it exists as water, it exists as it's just air, right? So can it gas, and so you can ask some pretty interesting questions about even material existence. Waves exist as particles, light exists as waves and also as particles, and that really makes our mind go, whoa, trippy, because how can something be both a wave and a particle? And so the natural world itself is filled with lots of complicated things that aren't self-evident, that aren't common sense, that don't present themselves in the way that they truly are if you start to think about them and unpack them. And in many ways, it makes sense that the natural sciences evolved from this approach, this empirical looking at the world approach and thinking about it and testing it. But when the social researchers, who were very influenced by the methods and precision and ability of the natural sciences, wanted to apply it to the social sciences, they kind of were in the same mindset of thinking, okay, well, the things that exist are things that we can, see. Like, you can measure if you're, in case of Durkheim, Protestant, Catholic, man, woman, crude binary, your age, and whatever else, right? We have all these sort of physical characteristics. And the way that the early researchers thought about them were not perfectly, not like a force of nature, but alongside that, because the whole point of the natural sciences assumes a kind of solidity of existence, a sort of materiality of interactions. Even if they're invisible to our eye, there are still these interactions going on. And so this perspective, even though it's a little bit of a fiction, obviously age in years is not something you can weigh. It's a concept, you can measure it. And the thing, age in years is consistent for everyone. And we know generally that, people get older and they get more frail and they get, sicker. Their priorities change or whatever else. And it doesn't always go the same way, but it tends to, as people get older, they think about retirement. They think about their health care more. They think about, how they're going to what's going to happen with their family members after they go. And it isn't deterministic, but it is quite universal, as it were. It's something that we would expect to find. We wouldn't be surprised to find it in that particular age group. But is that how aging really exists? I mean, is that how, when we talk about aging as a causal mechanism on people's attitudes, is it like gravity? I mean, it's not really, but it kind of is. And this is where the ontology of social research is, it gets a little like, yeah, we're going to kind of treat it like X, but we know it's not really like X. We're going to treat it like this for the purposes of our testing our ideas and the way our theories work. But we also know that, aging exists, but it doesn't exist the way gravity exists. We can't do a mathematically precise, deterministic, predictive model of how someone's going to be at 75 the way we can do with a cannonball over a certain distance, a certain weight, and at a certain angle on a windy day, for instance. And so there's kind of a little bit of a fiction going on in the quants side of things when we talk about causality and we talk about the way A affects B, in that we're doing it very much influenced and adhering to the way natural scientists want to be very precise about their observations. And we're assuming very similar causal relationships, even though the phenomenon we're studying don't exist like that. And so this is why when I see people really putting qual down or are dismissive of qualitative research or don't find it as insightful or whatever, it just kind of, I kind of reflect on, it's not a paper house, it's not like a house of cards, but there is a little bit of an agreed upon fiction in terms of the causal relationships imported from natural sciences that really that give us a good guide, but they're not quite as precise, obviously, as they are in the natural sciences for us. All right. Easy7 says, oh, hi, Sean. Welcome. Hope you are enjoying the nerdy lecture so far. Easy7 says, but Kristi, the fourth criteria of BIG, the big four, is rational coherence, non-contradiction. Therefore, seeing light as both a particle and a wave is not science. Okay, I know where that shade's coming from. I'll just let that sit for a second. And when it comes to qualitative research, it's much less comfortable or easy if you're coming from a natural science perspective, where there is this sort of fiction of solidity, there is this illusion of a solid ground of causality and things that you can measure, you can put your feet on. That it's not as solid as you think it is. And then you get over to qual and it becomes far more about people's perceptions and understandings of things. It seems to be getting softer and softer, but what it's becoming is more and more individualized. It's becoming more contextualized for each person, because although people have different demographic factors, sorry, whether that's their class location, their educational attainments, their ethnic backgrounds, their abilities or disabilities, these things are going to definitely set out a series of things around their lives that might feel deterministic or might even be deterministic in the general sense, but any one individual obviously is not going to react in the exact same way. So we can't treat people like atoms. We can't take a theory and claim that we're going to know exactly what people are going to do in the future, unlike fresh water at sea level, that boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Not everyone's going to vote for a Republican or a Democrat if you tick these boxes as to their characteristics or their attitudes, because people are complicated. And so you have these things that we think kind of work, and we can look at things. We can look at income. We can look at how old they are. We can look at where they live in the country. There are a lot of things that we can observe, and we know that there are patterns. But, it gets a little squishy because people are complicated. But that doesn't mean that the scientific knowledge, the tests that we're running and the data we're using and the rigor that we're applying is meaningless, or it doesn't have value. It just doesn't have you have to have a level of humility and understand that the data that you're working with could be updated next month with a new finding that filled a gap here and we understand a phenomenon better. So that is more of a, I don't know if I get down to it. Okay, yeah, no. So that's kind of a quantsy way of looking at stuff. It's really informed by the natural sciences. It really kind of adheres to that approach of causality, mirroring a materialist approach to the way that phenomenon exist, and kind of does this assumption that if we do good science, we can define things properly and then go out and measure them. And when we measure them, we can run tests with them and we can say something about this causal relationship. It's not untrue. It is true that we do those things. It's just not ever going to be what happens in the natural sciences. And then there's a more recent and more difficult, but also, I think, I don't want to say more truthful, but a more open way of looking at the way humans exist. And that is not to see reality as the process of aging, or to see social reality as the quantitative effect of class on, your attitudes towards X or your behaviors on Y in this more quantsy way. It really looks at social, well, this is it. It takes that there is a social reality that we need to get at, but you can only get at that social reality by asking people what they think, or looking at what people produce, or looking at the text that they write, or the speeches that they give, or the words that they use. And instead of locating, not instead of, but understanding or acknowledging that there exists a kind of reality that only emerges when there's when there's at least two people in the room, or a person lives in a society and has to conform to it. And I think last time I talked about how the idea of a rainbow, that a rainbow can come together. Rainbows are visions, but only illusions. But okay, so to get back to what was it? It's not, the Kermit song, Rainbow Connection, I think it was. When you see a rainbow, it looks solid, right? And you could probably point to where you think it is in the distance, like, oh, it's by that house over there. If we drove over there, we could see it. But what it really is it's something that emerges when the conditions of other things and our perception of them are correct. And in that moment, the rainbow exists for us. And that's the best way I can try to describe how I perceive social reality. Social reality exists as a combination of other people, either in the past or the current, in the present, doing things, thinking things, believing things that they then put in, that informs their actions, their behaviors, or the laws that they pass, or the societies that they create. And this social reality exists in the space between conversations. It exists in the practice of law. It exists in, conforming to driving on the left-hand side of the road. It exists when we say hi to each other. It exists when someone has a conversation trying to change someone's mind about bigotry and changing that social reality. And so in many ways, qualitative research has a much, how should I put this? If quants is like a box, like they want to put the world into a neat kind of, oh my gosh, I muted myself. It might not be, exactly what it is, but it's like 90% and it's pretty close, and there might be 10% that falls outside the box, but mostly we got what's in the box, and this will be pretty good. I think qualitative research looks at social reality more like a mist. Like you can still define it, you can still analyze it and put labels on it, but you also have to have some humility that by being a member of society, you are participating in this reality. quantitative social scientists like to think of themselves as being outside of the process. And that is a goal. It is for reasons of data purity, data accuracy. It should be, because there's an idea here of objectivity or whatever else. But in qualitative research, researchers you will find have a self-awareness that when, as I as a qualitative researcher, when I go do a focus group, and I sit down and I ask people questions, and they give me an answer, and I do a probe question, and I ask them to follow up. Like, so you said this word. What did you have in mind when you used that particular word? I'm not a neutral outside scientist person who is coming in and, investigating these people. I am actually co-creating this data with the person I'm asking the question, because they're reacting to my body language. They're reacting to the way I phrase the question. They're reacting to other things in the room. And it's not me studying them. It is a co-creative process where the researcher acknowledges that they have a role in this. And this is, again, completely opposite to the role of an experimental researcher. And from a feminist critique of methodologies, this isn't a flaw. It's merely the state of things. I can't, from a social constructivist perspective, if I'm talking to somebody, then I am co-creating the data that I will then analyze. And because this is what human beings do. And having that kind of humility and awareness as a researcher that you're there, and your role isn't to be an outside objective person, but understanding your role within the research data generation, and to be transparent about that with others. So, and of course, the other thing too is when you do a quant's perspective, you have these narrow categories and you want to fit everybody in your category because, whether or not it's a round peg in a square hole, you need to get that peg in as much as you can, because you have to, it's that standardization across your different respondents that allows you to make claims about this standardized process. Whereas qualitative research is far more about understanding what people think about things, what people understand about the world. It's not trying to fit them in a box. If anything, the researcher is trying to like the onus is on the researcher to understand the subject. It's not on the subject to conform to the theoretical operational terms of the researcher. And I'm not saying one is right, one is better. I think we need them both. We need both sides of, like the analysis of the rainbow. We need someone to explain the water and the angle and the optics and the sunlight and how the observer relates to the image. But we also need to understand rainbows in human society, not just as optical illusions. Then you understand how people feel about them, what they think about them, or what memories they have associated with them. Right? Because all the stuff about water particles and, light and refraction or whatever else can't tell you, the awe someone has when they look up at a cloudy, darkened sky with a storm coming and to just see this, massive rainbow that just arcs over a cornfield somewhere and just, it's like, wow, look how big that is. You can't get that in a quant's. I enjoy rainbows. I strongly agree. That's not quite the same as someone telling you the story about the first time, their parent or their friend told them about the story of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. These are completely different ways of understanding how people experience the world. So what does it say? What does it mean to say qualitatively that something exists? And what does it mean to say there is a social reality? And we don't think about our social reality. We think probably, if anything, it's more obvious to say how gravity affects my life every day, or how the process of aging, affects people over the course of their lives. But we don't see the social reality of going outdoors and not throwing my trash on the ground because that's socially unacceptable, or opening the door for someone and giving them a smile as a way of like having good social, like interactions. The way that if someone is brings you a plate of food at a restaurant, you wait until the next person or other people are on the table, unless you're at like more than 8, right? Ms. Manners, and they are served as well. You don't just start eating right away. And that is a social reality, as much as growing old is. But it doesn't feel like reality. It just feels like things people do. But we do those things because we've been conditioned to do those things to create this practice of politeness. And we do the steps in our dance to show that we have mastered this category of behavior in society. So we are self-regulating constantly. Human beings are constantly internalizing what is appropriate and inappropriate and conforming their behaviors or changing their behaviors or suppressing their behaviors in order to conform to that. Or even externally, money doesn't exist, but money will determine whether or not you live or die in this world. Social class doesn't exist except in the relations between people. And yet, based on someone's perception of your social class, they might hate you or have very little regard for you. And so while I think it's obvious to us how gravity impacts us every day, yay, we're not being thrown off the earth. That's a good thing, and we wouldn't be alive. We underestimate or fail to acknowledge that we are walking through a mist of social reality all the time. It is pervasive. Every time you talk to another person, you're engaging in social reality. It's again another. You talk about the rainbow. Another way I would think about it is the magic eye things that were. I don't think they've been. Is there like a fuzz? Sorry, they've been popular for about 20 years. But there used to be these pictures that have like these wild colors on them, and then if you like you did this thing with your vision where you looked through it a little bit, kind of crossed your eyes and looked past it. About like 3 inches behind the picture, suddenly maybe a hippopotamus outline would emerge, or a city skyscraper or something. And even though those images were there the whole time, unless you were looking at them in a specific way, it just looked like, a colorful picture. But then you're like, oh, if I look at it this way, then, oh, look, this thing pops out. And that is how I sort of understand social reality. There's a little bug. Oh, he's been crawling on my desk, and I tried to take him and shake him off, but now he's fallen under my bed. I don't know where he went. Anyway, we're going to be wrapping this up pretty soon. We only got about 4 slides, because like I said, I never get enough time to talk about this in my lecture, and I really think it's super important that my hope for you is if you didn't feel like you understood the concept of social reality, or maybe you needed to be reminded of it because you're very au fait with being able to picture and pull out social reality. But I just think so often people take social reality as a given rather than understanding it's a construct. It's like assuming, the existence of oxygen. Right? You're just around it so much, you don't necessarily think about it. But, and because people are so accustomed to conforming their behaviors and social norms and the way that culture operates, it's like background. They can't see it. It's like fish in water sort of things. And my goal is to get people to get a little bit better at like feeling that we live parallel existences. At least this is my take, right? I have a material existence. I have my body will age. It has a certain set of sex organs. I identify in a certain type of way, right? I have a certain level of melanin in my skin. I've come from a certain country. All of these things are fixed generally, right? Like I could change my nationality. I can't change how old I get. Some things are more mutable than others, but generally they're fixed or more fixed categories. And that feels kind of somehow real, right? But that's like most of my things aren't quantified in that kind of neat way, that observable way. It's how do I feel about something? What's my experience with something? What's my perspective? And these things are very important, but they're far more difficult to observe and consistently measure and quantify and put into a model. And we have to be able to do those things if we want to do the sciencey part of social science. And if we don't, then we need to feel comfortable in understanding, and I hope you'll feel like this after the qual course, is, how do we have valid information in qualitative research? How can we say things and be convincing? How do we know if we're wrong? How far can our claims go? Can we only speak to like just one little individual I talk to or this group of people, or can we say something a bit more broad? All right. I think we're just going to move on, because eventually I do want to get to what does it mean to know? What does it mean to know things? And I think that's really going to be a topic for another day. All right, I've got questions. If people have questions, I'll go ahead and take them. I'll natter on a little bit here, looking ahead to what I want to cover for next week. And then, of course, this is going now. So if you want to write any questions, comments, reflections, is your brain melting? Are these things that you're very well aware of, or are these things that you haven't really heard before? But yeah, we're going to look on next time, have a little discussion about what exactly it means when we say social reality, and whether or not, and the different ways we could possibly interpret that term reality as we're going about doing our stuff. Going to look a little bit, I think we're going to talk a bit more in depth about social constructions versus materialist, and also some of the terms that are used, because they're not always, we're going to get into more ontology, foundationalism, anti-foundationalism, and what does it mean to say something exists? What does it mean to say something is part of our reality? All right. Easy 7 does have a question, so I'm going to give you some time to type that out. Yeah, I can't think of any reason why we wouldn't be continuing on next Sunday. I'm just continuing on with this really nerdy topic of what exists, how we can know about it, and then what comes after that. We got some interesting stuff about the sciences, the start of the natural sciences. So ontology and epistemology, that's where we're going to be. What would your response be to the assertion that objectivity is inherently better than subjectivity? That is a really interesting question. Okay. Objectivity and subjectivity have value depending on what question you want to ask. And so, you can say that it's objectively true that Biden got X number of votes and Trump got Y number of votes, which were fewer. Or that this group of people turned out and this group of people didn't. Those kinds of objective, descriptive, even describing things causally, will never tell us why people do things. We can tell you why the theory predicts somebody will do something, but that isn't the same as knowing why individuals do that one thing. All right, let's say objectively we know that, it's almost too correlated to be true, too correlated to be reliable, but it's such an important variable that we always have to include it. Party identification is a really powerful predictor of how someone's going to vote. And it makes sense, right? If I identify as a Labour supporter or a Conservative supporter, chances are I'm going to vote for the Labour or Conservative candidate at my next election. But not everyone who is a Labour or a Conservative voter lives in a district where they feel like their vote is best placed. They might want to vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats or whatever else party, right? And so you can say objectively that partisan identification explains, 79% of the variation in vote choice. Well, that doesn't tell me anything as to why. And to do that, I have to talk to people. To do that, I have to look into subjectivity. And so you can't, when it comes to studying human beings, objectivity is only a descriptive statistic. it only describes the world. It doesn't help us to understand it. And understanding, because as I said, objectively you're testing theories. You're not understanding individuals. And so I don't think you can say you could really understand people without asking them for their subjective interpretation of why they do the things that we measure objectively. So I feel, it feels intuitively false to me, but I'm not sure how to articulate a clear response. Easy 7, does that help? So the objective only describes, but and this is my opinion, right? You might have other people who have other takes, but I just think that if you have an objective model that describes human behavior, no one human being is actually going to fit that model. You know, if you say that this coefficient has this effect and it's plus minus and it's this statistic, like that is an aggregate of like 2,000 people or 200 people, or you've got no one person for all these objective findings. And so ultimately you have to do the work of going to talk to people. And that for me, for instance, like take the party identification question. You know, you get like, well, so, you know, do you identify with a party and why? Or I guess I'm going to come back to this notion of a guy who was in my focus groups in 2010, who decided to vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats. He's a Labour voter all whole life, hated the Tories, hated Thatcher, hated David Cameron, hated them all. And Nick Clegg and Clegg Mania, all this stuff. He's like, you know what, I'm going to give them a go. Lib Dems are, you know, more likely to win the Colchester area. Again, this was a long time ago. Then the, you know, Labour candidate. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to vote Lib Dem and try to get the Tories out. It came back at post-election after the Liberal Democrats formed a coalition with the Conservatives. And this guy was so angry. So angry. He's like, I'll never vote Lib Dem again. I cut off my nose to spite my face. They've completely betrayed my trust. I will never, never, never vote Lib Dem again my whole life. And I interviewed him again in 2020, still talking about being burned in 2010. Right? That's one voter. Okay, the objectivist would say that's one person's story. Like, well, yeah, that's true. You've got one insight into someone who had a strong labor identification, flirted with a third party, ended up going home to his base party, and has subsequently never strayed again, right? But I can't learn anything about him from reading your model. Your model doesn't explain him because his explanation is based on his experience. And so I think the models don't help us if we can't relate them to real people in real world. Human beings are very different. Each one lives different lives. Yeah. Describing something is not necessarily the same as deeply understanding it. Yeah, is sort of my takeaway. Yes. I mean, it's important and it's great to be accurate, but description alone will not provide you insight into how individuals come to that decision or end up with that outcome. And the only way you can find that out is by asking them, which is why you need the subjectivity and you need the subjective in social research. All right. Are y'all, that's your nerdiness for this Sunday. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope I will see you again next week. So thank you, Easy7, DN fan. Who else in the chat? Like Corey, I saw Sean. Who else? Lindsay as well. Appreciate each of you stopping by. I appreciate your time and attention. And until next Sunday, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend, wherever it is and whenever it is you are. Yeah. And until that time, keep being awesome. All right. I'll catch y'all later. You can always put, join the Discord. The link's probably old. I'll sort it out later. Okay, never mind. I'm just going to say bye. Bye.